This is Mastercaster, taking you from zero to podcasting hero. And now here is your host, Neil Butler.
Before we go too far in this episode, I should explain what I mean by hosting your podcast. I'm not talking about a person who compares your podcast. I'm talking about the podcast equivalent of web hosting. Think about what we've achieved so far and where we need to get to. We have our first podcast episode completed and it's saved on our hard drive or network. We now need a process for taking that episode from only being available as an MP3 file on your computer to being visible and available to potential listeners or subscribers via podcast stores. While it's possible to manage all of that yourself via a really simple syndication or RSS feed, the much easier process is to use the services of one of the podcast hosting platforms. Some of the platforms you may have heard of include Podbean, Buzzsprout, Spreaker, Whooshkaa, and the one we use for all of our podcasts, podcast.co. The great thing about most of these podcast hosting services is that once you've set your podcast up, you'll only ever need to upload your MP3 file and add some episode notes. We need to address two main questions in this episode. Firstly, how do I choose a podcast hosting platform? And secondly, once I've made that decision, what do I need to do to set my podcast up? Well, let's deal with those two questions in turn. The best way to decide on a suitable podcast hosting service is to ask somebody who already produces a podcast. They'll already be using a podcast hosting service and will probably have an opinion about that service and maybe why they chose that one ahead of others. Some things you'll need to consider include how much storage space you require, how much you're prepared to pay, and what other services you might want them to provide. For example, getting your podcast listed in the various stores, a web page for your podcast, etc. I've used 4 different podcast hosting services during the past few years and have decided that I like podcast.co best. Their service is slightly more expensive than some of the others, but given the amount of podcasting we do, the need to be confident in the support we receive and the quality and the reliability of the service made that decision for us. A couple of other features we like with podcast.co is the submission of our podcast to 10 of the most popular podcast stores and the fact that each podcast gets its own podcast-related webpage. Other hosting services do similar things. Please take some time to research your options and to chat to other podcasters to see which service suits your needs best. Let's just spend a moment considering the podcast submission process. This is a one-off process where you need to submit the details of your new podcast to the various stores in which you want it listed. If you think that being listed in a couple of stores is all you need, you may choose to submit your podcast yourself. The process isn't very difficult, it's just a little time consuming, particularly when submitting to Apple Podcasts. Once your podcast is listed in each store, every time you upload a new episode to your hosting service, it will automatically appear as a new episode in the podcast stores. But you'll either need to do that initial setup work for each podcast store yourself, or choose a hosting service who does it for you. Let's assume that you've now chosen and subscribed to your selected podcast hosting service. The next step is the setup. The steps that I explain now are based on what happens with podcast.co. While every hosting service has their own processes and requirements, broadly speaking, they'll be the same as each other. The first thing to do is to log on to your hosting service. There'll be a settings tab or similar on which you enter the data you want to present to your potential listeners and subscribers. On this page, you'll provide the name of your podcast, an overview of your podcast, and your podcast graphic or tile. These 3 things will be displayed in each of the podcast stores and will be the information that people browsing the store will see relating to your podcast. There are also a number of other fields on the settings page, such as the author's name and email address, any copyright information, and so on. The next step is to decide whether you want the hosting service to submit your podcast to each of the major podcast stores. In my mind, there's no reason not to have your podcast listed in each of the major stores, so I'd be asking them to do the work for you. Please understand that not all stores will offer that service, and this being offered or not may play a part in you choosing one hosting service over another. If they don't offer that service, you'll need to understand and complete the process that is required to submit your podcast to each individual store. Broadly speaking, it involves going through each of the podcast stores, creating an account and submitting your podcast details, including the RSS feed. The RSS feed is the podcast equivalent to a website's URL. It's the pointer that each podcast store uses to find your content on the hosting platform's server. Once your podcast feed has been submitted to the stores, it's then just a matter of time. Some podcast stores add your podcast to their store almost immediately. Others take a few days before you can see your podcast in their catalog. One thing to keep in mind is that while some hosting services will do that submission task for you, it will only occur after you have uploaded your first episode to the hosting platform. At this point, you've pretty much done everything you need to do to have your podcast available in your chosen podcast stores. In our next conversation, we'll talk a little more about how to distribute your podcast, that is, the mechanics of your audience being able to listen to each episode.
This has been another episode of Mastercaster. For more information about Mastercaster or the other services provided by Untypical Media, please visit www.mastercaster.co or follow Mastercaster on Facebook and LinkedIn.